And if you read the history, the biographies of the men who shaped the world since World War II, they didn't all have those tendencies, but they all had something at least as bad or much worse. All of them. For example, who hasn't heard of Ernest Hemingway? One of the greatest writers of the 20th century. I guess, before I was a Christian, I'd seen For Whom the Bell Tolls at least perhaps 2 or 3 times. And I've watched it on television. You know, there's a channel on television where you can get all the movies that are 60 years old. And I've seen For Whom the Bell Tolls and that. It's a very great story. Hemingway was a wonderful, wonderful writer. He wasn't a good man. He was not a wonderful, wonderful man. Hemingway's parents were Christians, Congregationalists. And Congregationalists are very hard to beat. Congregationalists believe each congregation makes decisions for itself and rejects any hierarchical system. They say that's what it was with the early church, and that's the way it should be now. So Hemingway's parents were Congregationalists. His father was an excellent physician, but he's also an outdoor man, hunted and fished and camped, and he taught all these things to Ernest. The mother was very well read, very intelligent, but perhaps a bit too bossy, and Ernest came to hate his mother. One of his fellow intellectuals said years later, "You're the first man I've ever met that hated his mother." But Ernest did. And when she wrote to him as a young man, "Now I hope you're remembering to read the Bible and say your prayers," he wrote back, "Dear Mama, of course I would never forget either." And of course he was lying. He never ever read the Bible. He never ever said his prayers. Hemingway was a man who had an old-fashioned view about women. He had the old-fashioned view that women's sole purpose of existence was to serve men. He married 4 times, and he had scores of relationships apart from those marriages. And all the marriages were fiascos. There was a very intelligent woman, Martha Gellhorn, one of his wives, who occasionally tried to tell Ernest he wasn't living right. She said he was the biggest liar since Baron Munchausen. Do any of you remember the story about Baron Munchausen? He's the man that pulled himself out of a bog by pulling on his own pigtail. And if you can believe that, you believe anything. But Baron Munchausen is the most famous liar of history. But Martha Gellhorn said that Ernest Hemingway beat Munchausen. He couldn't open his mouth without lying, she said. On one occasion, they were driving along in Havana, and they got into an argument. He was always arguing with his wives, publicly, privately. And ultimately, he slaps her. She's driving. So without even blinking, she heads the Lincoln, a very expensive car, you understand. She heads the Lincoln for a big tree and hits it, leaves the driver's seat and leaves Ernest with his jaw somewhat dropped to survey the damage of the Lincoln. Another wife, Mary Welch, who was really the wife of an Australian journalist whom he stole, early in their relationship he found that she still had pictures of a real husband. So he grabbed these pictures, tore them in pieces, put them in the toilet, then aimed his submachine gun at it and shattered it and flooded the hotel room. That was Ernest. He was a mixture of art, vanity, and lust, and cruelty. He was all of those things. He had problems with his sight that he'd inherited from his mother, and he should have been wearing glasses all the time, but he had the reputation of being a big outdoor man. Why should he wear glasses? And as a result, he had all sorts of accidents. I jotted down some of the accidents that Ernest Hemingway had because of drunkenness. He was an alcoholic. He couldn't have a cup of tea without pouring gin into it. But because of alcoholism And because of pride, he wouldn't wear his glasses out of doors when he should have. He had innumerable accidents. Here are some of them. He gouged his tonsils when a stick that he stirred up came into his mouth. Got a fish hook in his back. Accidents from boxing and football. Blown up in the war in Spain. Smashed his fist through a glass showcase. Cut his foot on broken glass. Internal bleeding by fall on a boat. Mistook a skylight cord for a lavatory chain. Pulled on it and the whole thing came down. Gave him concussion and 9 stitches. Tore a groin muscle. Damaged his fist with a punching bag. Hurt by a bolting horse. Broke his arm in a car crash. Shot himself in the leg while drunk. Broke his big toe kicking in a locked gate. Smashed his fist through a window. Damaged the pupil of bad eye and later the pupil of the good eye. 2 more concussions in car acid. He was badly clawed while playing with a lion for cameras in Africa. Gashed head and legs, severing an artery in a boat fall. Sprained his shoulder falling out of a car, etc., etc., etc. There's some of the accidents Hemingway had because of his pride and because of his drunkenness. After 2 plane accidents, he wasn't afraid he was going to die. He was afraid he might not be going to die. So he got his rifle and put new canisters in it and just shot himself through the mouth and blew up the top of his head. He was then 62 years of age. Hemingway is a man that's influenced millions because he was a great, great writer, but he was not a great man. But the man who's influenced most to shape our modern world goes back a long way. He was Rousseau, Jacques Rousseau, who lived before the French Revolution and, according to Napoleon, Louis XVI and many of the contemporaries, mainly responsible for the revolution, because Rousseau taught the sovereignty of the people. And he had what was known as the social contract, why the people give themselves fully to the government and the government looks fully after the people. Of course, it never works. Karl Marx borrowed from Rousseau. Rousseau was a funny guy. Perhaps the woman he knew best summed him up best when she said he was an interesting madman. He was a masochist. He was paranoid. He was narcissistic. He thought he was the most important person in the universe. He was neurasthenic, that is, he seemed to live on his nerves. He couldn't make a friendship. He became angry with everyone that helped him. He was noted for his ingratitude. He was immoral. He was an onanist. If you don't know what an onanist is, O-N-A-N-I-S-T, look up your concordance under O-N-A-N. He was one of those. But he was a great writer, like Hemingway. His most famous book is called Confessions, which is written in a spirit that needs confessing because it's a very boastful and lying spirit. He used to read this book for 17 hours with meal breaks in the salons of France. Well, it's a very boastful book. He never ever loved anyone, really. A servant girl attached herself to him in a common law marriage. For 30 years, he said, I never ever felt the least glimmer of love for her. But he had 5 children by her, and one by one they were dropped into the orphanage. And he never ever sought to find out what happened to any of them. And he wrote a famous book on education, how to educate children. A book called Emile, which had many good things and some things not so good. It's a book that influenced Froebel, Pestalozzi, Montessori, John Dewey,